Welcome, brave travelers of time. Imagine a world of towering castles, endless wars, and knights clad in steel. The Middle Ages were an era when kingdoms clashed, religions collided, and entire nations rose or fell on the battlefield. But medieval wars were not just about swords and shields. They were stories of clever tactics, strange weapons, legendary leaders, and sometimes bizarre events that sound almost unbelievable today. In this documentary, we'll uncover fascinating tales from medieval warfare, battles where the outnumbered triumphed, weapons so terrifying they were banned by the church, leaders who became saints, and others who inspired nightmares. So prepare yourself. For the next half hour, we'll march through blood-soaked fields, stand beneath castle walls, and witness the extraordinary stories that define the Middle Ages. The 100 Years' War between England and France produced many famous clashes, but none more legendary than Agincourt. In October 1415, King Henry V of England led an exhausted, sick, and starving army through northern France. He hoped simply to reach the port of Calais, but the French nobility, eager for glory, gathered a force that dwarfed the English. Some estimates claim the French outnumbered the English by as much as 5-1. The French knights, armored in steel from head to toe, believed victory was certain. After all, what chance did tired English peasants stand against the flower of French chivalry? But Henry had a secret weapon, the English longbow. For decades, England had trained its commoners to wield this massive bow, requiring years of practice and incredible strength. At Agincourt, those bows would prove devastating. The battlefield itself worked against the French. Days of rain had turned the fields into thick, clinging mud. When the French knights charged, their heavy armor dragged them down. Horses stumbled, men slipped, and then the arrows fell. Tens of thousands of shafts darkened the sky, piercing armor, bringing down men and horses alike. Those who reached the English lines found themselves packed so tightly in the mud they could barely raise their swords. The English simply pushed them back, and the French fell in heaps, crushed by their own comrades. By nightfall, the French nobility lay shattered. Thousands were dead, including many of France's most powerful lords. England had won one of the most unlikely victories in medieval history. Agincourt became a legend not just of English courage, but of how technology and terrain called Verdun the pride of knights. For over 1,000 years, the walls of Constantinople had stood unbroken. 3 massive layers of stone, a marvel of engineering, had protected the Byzantine capital against countless invaders. But in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire brought something new: gunpowder. His army dragged enormous cannons across hundreds of miles, including one so massive it required 60 oxen just to move. Day and night, the bombardment shook the earth. Stones weighing half a ton crashed into the walls. Still, the Byzantines resisted, patching holes and praying for relief. Inside the city, fear and faith mingled. Priests led processions by torchlight, singing hymns beneath the trembling walls. For them, Constantinople was not just a city, it was the last beacon of the Roman Empire, a holy fortress of Christendom. On May 29th, the final assault began. Wave after wave of Ottomans hurled themselves at the defenses. At last, a small gate was left unguarded. Through it, the Turks surged. Emperor Constantine XI, the last Byzantine ruler, threw off his crown and charged into battle, never to be seen again. By noon, the city had fallen. Churches that had stood for centuries were converted to mosques. For the Christian world, it was a catastrophe. For the Ottomans, it was the dawn of empire. Many historians mark 1453 as the true end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. In Scotland, the fight for independence against England reached its turning point at Bannockburn. Robert the Bruce, a king once hunted as an outlaw, now stood against a massive English army. His men were fewer, less armored, and far less wealthy, but Robert understood something the English did not: the land itself. He positioned his army on marshy ground, where English cavalry could not maneuver. His spearmen, standing in tightly packed schiltrons, formed bristling walls of pikes. When the English knights charged, expecting to sweep the Scots aside, their horses bogged down in the mud. Spears pierced their mounts, and armored men toppled helplessly. In a shocking reversal, the Scots not only held their ground, but pushed the English back. Panic spread, and soon the mighty English army was in retreat. Bannockburn secured Robert the Bruce's reputation as Scotland's great liberator. To this day, it remains one of Scotland's proudest victories. 17 years before Bannockburn, another Scottish hero rose to fame: William Wallace. At Stirling, English forces attempted to cross a narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth. Their plan was simple: cross in strength, crush the Scots. But Wallace had a theory. He waited patiently until a large portion of the English army was trapped on the bridge. Then, with a sudden charge, the Scots struck. Panic set in. Soldiers fell into the river, drowning under the weight of their armor. The bridge collapsed, and with it, the English hopes of victory. It was a masterstroke of strategy. Wallace had turned a humble bridge into a death trap, proving that brains could defeat brute force. Though Wallace's rebellion would ultimately end in tragedy, Stirling Bridge became a symbol of Scottish defiance and of the power of clever tactics. Among the many terrifying inventions of the medieval world, none was more mysterious or more feared than Greek fire. The Byzantine Empire, surrounded by enemies on land and sea, developed this secret weapon sometime in the 7th century. To their enemies, it looked like magic, a stream of liquid fire, sprayed from bronze tubes mounted on ships, that could cling to water, spread across the waves, and burn anything it touched. Imagine the horror of a sailor watching flames race across the sea itself. Armor, wood, flesh, it mattered little. Once Greek fire touched you, escape was nearly impossible. The Byzantines guarded its formula with extreme secrecy. Only a handful of families were said to know the ingredients, and passing them on was punishable by death. When enemies captured the weapons, they could never recreate them. Some modern historians believe it may have been based on crude oil, mixed with sulfur or quicklime. Others argue it was something even more exotic. Whatever its composition, its effect was undeniable. Whole fleets of Arab ships were destroyed by it. The Byzantines used Greek fire for centuries to hold back waves of invasion, creating a legend that terrified their foes. And then, mysteriously, it was lost. The knowledge disappeared with the fall of Constantinople. To this day, nobody knows the exact recipe. Greek fire remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. While the Byzantines ruled the seas with fire, armies on land relied on machines of unimaginable power. Chief among them was the trebuchet. This colossal siege engine worked like a giant catapult, hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds over castle walls. Powered not by torsion but by a massive counterweight, it could fling projectiles farther and harder than any weapon of its time. But the trebuchet was more than just a tool of war, it was a symbol of terror. Imagine being inside a besieged castle, hearing the groan of ropes and wood, then the distant thunder as a stone the size of a cow smashed into your walls. Night after night, the bombardment continued, breaking both stone and spirit. Some trebuchets were so large they had names. One of the most famous, built by King Edward I of England, was called Warwolf. Chroniclers claimed it was the most powerful trebuchet ever constructed. When the defenders of Stirling Castle so assembled, they surrendered. But Edward, enjoying the spectacle, refused their surrender until Warwolf had fired at least once just to show its strength. Trebuchets didn't just hurl stones. Diseased carcasses, beehives, even flaming barrels of pitch were launched to spread fear and sickness inside enemy walls. In many ways, the trebuchet was an early form of psychological warfare. Few debates in medieval warfare were as fierce as the one between the longbow and the crossbow. The English longbow was a monster of a weapon. Over 6 feet tall, made from yew wood, it required years of training and extraordinary strength. Archers developed thick, knotted muscles in their shoulders and arms, and even their skeletons show the strain of constant practice. But in battle, the longbow was unmatched. Its arrows could pierce armor at 200 yards, and a skilled archer could fire 10 or more shots a minute. Across Europe, however, the crossbow was preferred, and like the longbow, it required little training. A peasant could be armed with one and made deadly within weeks, by cranking back the string with a lever or windlass. The crossbow could store immense power, releasing a bolt with armor-piercing force. The weapon was so feared that in 1139, The Pope declared the crossbow inhuman and tried to ban its use against Christians, but the ban was ignored where cares little for morality. So which was better? Longbows dominated in battles like Crécy and Agincourt, where trained English archers shredded their foes. Crossbows, meanwhile, ruled the cities and fortresses of continental Europe, where they could be used effectively from walls or in close quarters. Together, these two weapons signal the decline of the knight. No matter how thick the armor, an arrow or bolt could bring down even the proudest noble. The age of the mounted knight was slowly coming to an end. In 1429, a 17-year-old peasant girl stepped onto the stage of history and forever changed the course of France. Her name was Joan of Arc. France at that time was nearly broken. English armies had conquered vast regions, and many believed French resistance was doomed. But Joan claimed she had visions, voices of saints and angels commanding her to drive out the English and crown the Dauphin as king. To many, she seemed mad, but her confidence and purity impressed even hardened soldiers. Against all odds, the French crown gave her armor, a banner, and command of troops. At the siege of Orleans, Joan led from the front, rallying men who had lost hope. Chroniclers say she seemed fearless, carrying her white banner through clouds of arrows. Her courage was contagious. With Indes, the English siege collapsed. For the first time in years, France had hope. Joan's victories paved the way for Charles VII's coronation, but her triumph was short-lived. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English, she was tried for heresy. At just 19 years old, she was burned at the stake in Rouen. Yet her death only magnified her legend. Centuries later, she was declared a saint. To this day, Joan of Arc remains one of the most extraordinary figures in world history, a simple girl who changed a nation's destiny. During the Third Crusade, two names towered above all others: Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart, and Saladin, the great Muslim leader. Richard was every inch the warrior king, tall, fierce, and relentless in battle. Saladin was equally formidable, a skilled general and devout leader who had united the Muslim world. They clashed repeatedly over the Holy Land, yet, remarkably, these two enemies respected each other. Richard once fell ill, and Saladin sent him fresh fruit and even his personal physician. On another occasion, when Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him to new ones so the fight could continue fairly. Neither side achieved total victory. Richard captured key cities but failed to retake Jerusalem. Saladin held the Holy City but could not drive out the Crusaders completely. Still, their rivalry became a legend of medieval chivalry, a reminder that even in brutal wars, honor could survive. Not all medieval leaders were remembered for honor. Some became infamous for sheer terror, none more so than Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler. Ruling in the mid-15th century, Vlad faced constant invasions from the mighty Ottoman Empire. Outnumbered and desperate, he resorted to psychological warfare of darkest kind. His chosen method of execution was impalement. Victims were hoisted on wooden stakes and left to die slowly, a gruesome fate meant to strike fear into all who saw it. Chronicles claim that in one campaign alone, Vlad impaled over 20,000 prisoners. When Sultan Mehmed II marched into Wallachia, his army stumbled upon a forest of corpses, stretching for miles. The sight was so horrifying that many Ottomans fled before battle even began. To his people, Vlad was a defender against foreign conquest. To his enemies, he was a monster. His cruelty gave birth to legends that centuries later inspired Bram Stoker's creation of Count Dracula. In Vlad, we see the darkest extremes of medieval warfare, where fear itself became a weapon. Of all the warrior orders of the Middle Ages, none captured the imagination like the Knights Templar. Founded after the First Crusade, their mission was simple: protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They were monks, bound by vows of poverty and chastity, yet also knights fearsome in battle, easily recognized by their white mantles marked with a red cross. The Templars became one of the most elite military forces in the Crusades. Chroniclers wrote of small groups of Templars holding off entire armies. fighting to the death rather than surrender. Their discipline and bravery were legendary, but the Templars were more than warriors. Over time, they built a vast financial network, essentially inventing early forms of banking. A pilgrim could deposit money in Paris and withdraw it safely in Jerusalem thanks to the Templars. Their wealth and power grew so great that kings began to fear them. In 1307, King Philip IV of France accused the Templars of heresy, devil worship, and countless crimes. Under torture, confessions were extracted. The order was disbanded, and many Templars were burned at the stake. Yet rumors persisted. Tales of hidden treasure, secret rituals, and holy relics followed the Templar Sinto legend. Even today, they appear in countless books and films. The truth is simpler, yet no less fascinating. The Knights Templar were warriors and bankers, saints and sinners, symbols of the strange blend of faith, money, and violence that defined medieval war. In the 15th century, England was torn apart by one of the bloodiest civil wars in its history. It was a struggle not between nations, but between families to rival branches of the royal Plantagenet dynasty, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Lancaster's symbol was a red rose, York's a white rose. Thus the conflict became forever known as the War of the Roses. For 30 years, the crown of England passed back and forth. Kings were crowned, deposed, and killed in rapid succession. The battles were savage and personal, and like wars against foreign enemies, this was brother against brother, cousin against cousin. Nobles switched sides constantly, betraying yesterday's ally for tomorrow's advantage. The Battle of Towton in 1461 was the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. On a snowy March day, tens of thousands clashed in a storm of arrows and swords. Chroniclers claim over 20,000 men were left dead in the snow, their blood staining it red. But it was not just the battlefield that shaped the war. Political intrigue and ruthless ambition played equal roles. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of Lancaster, proved a formidable commander and strategist, while Richard, Duke of York, and his sons became icons of the opposing cause. The conflict ended only when Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant, defeated King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Richard, the last Plantagenet king, was cut down in the mud, his crown found beneath a thorn bush. Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses atop Tudor rose, a symbol that still endures. The War of the Roses left England scarred, its nobility decimated, but it also paved the way for the powerful Tudor dynasty under kings and queens like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, who would transform England into a world power. While England fought itself, it had already waged one of the longest and strangest wars in medieval Europe, the Hundred Years' War. Despite the name, it lasted for longer, from 1337 to 1453, a span of 116 years. It was not one continuous war, but a series of campaigns, truces, and renewed fighting, stretching across for generations. At its heart was a question of legitimacy. English kings claimed the throne offerings through family ties. The French, of course, rejected this. The result, a century of bloodshed. Viewers saw some of the most famous battles in medieval history: Crécy, Poitiers, and of course, Agincourt. It was during these battles that the longbow proved its devastating power, reshaping the nature of medieval combat. But the war was not only fought by kings and knights. Entire villages were burned, peasants slaughtered, and the countryside ravaged. Disease, famine, and banditry spread like wildfire. For ordinary people, the 100 Years' War was not a tale of glory, but of endless suffering. Yet from the ashes of this chaos emerged heroes, none more famous than Joan of Arc, whose visions inspired the French to turn the tide. Her martyrdom gave France a symbol strong enough to endure centuries. By the war's end, the English had lost nearly all their territory in France, holding only Calais. France emerged stronger, while England was left exhausted in unstable conditions that would soon explode into the War of the Roses. The 100 Years' War reshaped both nations. It marked the twilight of the medieval night and the dawn of gunpowder and professional armies. In many ways, it was the war that ended Middle Ages itself. And so, our journey through medieval wars comes to an end. We have walked the muddy fields of Agincourt, stood beneath the trembling walls of Constantinople, and seen the terror of Greek fire. We have met saints like Joan of Arc, and monsters like Vlad the Impaler. We have watched kingdoms torn apart in the War of the Roses, and generations consumed by the 100 Years' War. The Middle Ages were a time of brutality and faith, of invention and destruction, of courage and cruelty. Wars were not fought only with swords, but with ideas, technology, and sheer willpower. What survives are the stories tales of victories against impossible odds, weapons that defied belief, and people who became legends. Which of these fascinated you the most? Was it the burning mystery of Greek fire, the defiance of Scotland's heroes, or its strange chivalry between Richard and Saladin? Let us know in the comments. And if you wish to travel further into history, don't forget to subscribe, so together we can continue uncovering the wonders and the horrors of the past. Thank you for joining me, and until next time, may history's lessons guide us well.